It's wonderful to welcome Nathan Pinkoski on this program for the third time. He currently serves as the research fellow at the Institute for Philosophy, Technology, and Politics at St. Patrick's Seminary. He recently contributed an article for First Things in the October issue of 2024. It is titled Hannah and Her Resistors. Is a review of a new book on Hannah Arendt by Lindsay Stonebridge, a professor from the UK, but we are focusing our discussion today on just the thinker herself, Hannah Arendt. Nathan, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me back on the show.
Right, yeah. We were planning to have our discussion actually yesterday. So today is October 24th. But we were planning to have it on October 23rd, which was a pretty apt day because it was the anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And Arendt wrote an article on that. It's titled Totalitarian Imperialism. So, from what you know of that writing piece, what did she make of the Hungarian Revolution?
Yeah, I mean, I'd actually have to refresh myself on that one. Just thinking offhand about the much of her dynamic there. Um, Look, she was very attentive to the events as they were playing out in 1956, and she was as often in her career, very hopeful about the possibilities that might emerge in these kinds of revolutionary moments. One thing, though, I think that is useful, if I recall correctly, is being hopeful is not the same as being optimistic. It's not saying that if you just have a revolution, the outcome will automatically be a good thing. And in fact, Stonebridge in her book, I think, alludes to this briefly very well to the aspect about her treatment of the revolution in 56. So we get from her a kind of assessment about what kinds of possibilities can emerge from a genuine political moment like this, like what happened at the start of 56, but a kind of realism about not assuming things are going to work out very well, if at all. And I think also what was clear for her at that moment, as for many other Europeans too, is how much the Soviet Empire depended upon the raw exercise of power. And so it was at that point, and this is where it fits into our other kinds of themes, other concerns. We see the Soviet Union beginning to lose its whatever appeal to legitimacy it might have because it has to resort to violence to stay ahead. Uh, and um, and that's a dynamic that she thinks is very important. It's also too we should just bear in mind that the event of 56 was for many members of the European left and many European communists a kind of exposure of the fraud of the Soviet system. I think I have to recall the numbers on this, but I think the British Communist Party lost a third of its membership in the immediate aftermath because people were so disgusted by what had taken place. The other thing too about the 56 revolution, which I think is just interesting to bear in mind as well, and I don't think Arendt discusses this directly there, but again, I'd have to look back at the essay to see what she says, is the Soviet propaganda here and the Eastern Bloc propaganda was trying to portray the uprising as a fascist uprising. So these were the fascists who were trying to take control. And historically, that's just not true. If anything, there were also members of the left who were dissatisfied with what had taken place and trying to articulate it. But I think it's a good demonstration of how anti-fascist propaganda works. And you really had a choice when you were viewing the events to believe the anti-fascist propaganda or to reject it. And I think what what many many people who examine this. I think of Francois Furet in his book, The Passing of the Illusion, where this was a momentous part in his own career, abandoning the left and so forth, is that people who went through this, who went through the study of 56 and came out of it disgusted with the Communist Party, also began to be suspicious of the anti-fascist framing, where you try to frame your enemy always as a fascist, and you kind of end up rushing into this purity test to see who is the most anti-fascist of all. And of course, that purity test is designed to favor the communists because they're meant to be the ones who are totally free of the taint of fascism. So I think that's a dynamic that's going on there in 56. Some of those themes right now, without looking at the text, I'm able to say, yes, that's what Arendt talks about. Some of them are, I think, broader extrapolations, a little bit on the historical context there that might be important for people to bear in mind, because, as I said, it was really for left-wing intellectuals in the 1950s. That was really a watershed moment.
Yes. I've been reading over that essay just yesterday to, just to commemorate the anniversary and such. And also since I'm living here in Budapest, Hungary. Um,
Yeah, so you should correct me if I've said anything that deviates too much from what she said.
I see. I think broadly you got it correctly. But I like to bring up this quote from the essay that she wrote here. So, quote, when Soviet Russian tanks crushed the revolution in Hungary, they actually destroyed the only free and revolutionary Soviet, as in councils, workers' councils, in existence anywhere in the world. Yeah. And yeah, that is the end of the quote. And I think it's something to bear in mind because I think by that time the Soviets they've thrown away their legitimacy as as a workers' movement or any kind of movement for those who are exploited by capitalism.
Yeah, and I also we see just on the notion of the Soviet there, that it's good you brought that up too. This is something that comes up at other times in Arendt's writings. Her interest in the Commune of 1870, 1871 that emerged there, 1871, I should say, because that's when it's crushed. And her interest in these kinds of what could we call them? Truly political societies where people at a local level are defined by their by relationships of equality. She sees this as an important part of the of what it is to have what genuine politics looks like, or what the genuine, authentic political phenomena look like. And we don't have many instances of these in late modernity that we can point to. But this is an important one that she draws attention to. And it's also good to bear in mind too, because sometimes we see when we're hearing or talking about Arendt, hearing discussions of her work, we sometimes see the chart. Oh, she's just nostalgic for the Greek city-state. It's all just a kind of effort to retrieve that way of doing politics and just bringing it back into modernity, and you either suggest, well, she's guilty of some kind of nostalgic thinking, or maybe you accuse her of a kind of crypto-reactionary thought. But these are instances where I think we see that kind of argument falsified. She actually can point to genuine historic occurrences, which she calls genuine political phenomena in the modern context. And it's not just one instance of it, like the Commune. She's able to draw attention to this phenomenon recurring. It may be rare, but it is recurring. It does happen still, like in 56.
Mhm. You mentioned at the beginning of your piece in First Things right now that um, and this is a point worth quoting. One of the greatest beneficiaries of Donald Trump's 2016 election was Hannah Arendt, or at least her literary estate. In the first year of Trump's presidency, sales of Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism soared by 1,000%. Why do you believe this is the case?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are several factors. One is that there was a kind of many of us who recall that time, there was a kind of certainty about the correct prediction that would emerge in 2016. This notion that, well, this person couldn't possibly be president. Look, all the polls show that he's 10 points behind, 8 points behind. So there was that aspect, that confidence in social science and social scientific predictions that had that. But it was also, too, I think that for many people in kind of the elite circles, in the chattering classes, there was an unintelligibility about the whole phenomenon. People just didn't really understand what was happening, and that was one of the things that I think confused people in also when he began to become the top of the poll at the top of the Republican list in 2015. So there was an unintelligibility about the whole Trump phenomenon, that the vocabulary and concepts that people looked to just wasn't available. They couldn't make sense of this. If Ted Cruz was ahead, oh sure, we could run. We have vocabulary for that. Neoconservative, the kind of thing that sounded like the kinds of criticisms that were made about evangelical Christians in, say, the second Bush administration, right? But you couldn't do that with Trump. So there was a desperate grasp around, I think, afterwards for a kind of explanatory theory. And one of the things that we do, I think this is partly our own habits of thinking, just at the point we are culturally, is we just look to the Second World War. That's the lodestar of how our kind of our not more than just a set of intellectual habits. It's almost our civic religion. We look to the Second World War to define ourselves. And Arendt has a very good account of that. And so there was a sense that by a lot of people that we could look to this text to explain what was going on. And some of that is, of course, uh, mistaken. I don't think that's an accurate description of the era by any stretch. But I think the more charitable thing to say just is that there was a confusion about what was happening, and a desire to find an explanation that made Arendt's style of argumentation, the kind of phenomena that she was looking at. I think most important, her sense that the arc of history always doesn't move always in one direction. In fact, to think that way is itself a problem. That was, I think, one of the reasons why her thinking became popular and her book sold well, because Origins of Totalitarianism is not a book that has a progressivism about it, a kind of confidence in the way that history is going. And because so many intellectuals really are progressives in the sense of neo-Hegelian, having a commitment to a particular ideological victory and seeing that just pushes along. Um, her thesis was fresh for them, and they understood that their positions were not necessarily mistaken, but needed to be revised in significant ways. And Arendt provides some of the resources to do that. Hence why her books sold well.
Yeah. And to the point of the present moment, since I've been living in Hungary now, which a lot of English language media completely misunderstands and totally trashes just because it has a problematic prime minister, so to speak. What I see is that the year 2016 saw the election of Donald Trump in the US, but on the other side of the Atlantic, you see a member of the European Union break away from the European Union for the first time in the European Union's history. And following that, there were several uh, popular movements, say the Gilets jaunes in France, and recently the Dutch farmers, and certain leaders who are of the right wing bent begin to take power, say Orban and recently also Meloni. And these events, I think, shocked the chattering class, as you've mentioned, because from what I can see, they always believe that there's a sort of consensus of ideas that Western nations should focus on, um, at least in an international stage. So towards democracy, global free trade, and human rights are the the bedrock terms. Everything else is just follows from there. But they do not see that there's a coterie of people and groups who yearn for other values, which are goods in themselves, like nation, family, and tradition. So these are the people behind the all the popular movements that I've listed, including the Brexit movement and including the election and probably the second election of Trump. I might date myself here, but yeah. To what extent did Arendt foresee this kind of reaction against a tenuously held consensus of politics?
Well, I think that, and I mentioned this briefly in the essay, I think that she did spot the revolt against bureaucratic control, the tightening of bureaucratic control. I don't think she would have described, she wouldn't have used some of the language that you did about defensive of tradition. That's obviously an important part of what's happening in the what's been happening in the past decade, even further than that, I think, in terms of trying to grasp the populist phenomenon. But in Europe, um, especially, she doesn't raise the immigration question, which is the one that has been in Europe, especially haunting the whole discussion, as probably the defining issue there. But what she does have a grasp of, I think, is the sense that the promise of post-war progressive politics, and this is a promise that emanates from the United States, it emanates from Kennedy, it emanates from Johnson, the sense that if we just deepen the welfare state, if we deepen the construction, the centralization demands that emerged with the nation state after the French Revolution, we will have a better society, we will have a better politics. And she was very good for seeing that that would not work. That would produce further tensions, difficulties, and a revolt, a backlash against that whole way of arranging institutions. And it's not the most the thing she devotes the most attention to in her writings, but by On Violence, by that text that she writes. You see her interest in this and her drawing attention to it. And we should recall, too, that that comes out just at the time whereby people are noticing this shift in the American electorate, the distrust of government, which we sometimes associate with, oh, that's because of Watergate, right? That doesn't come about till 73, 74, but it actually emerges in the late 60s. And it's a shift that you had to be very attentive to spot in the late 60s, how the confidence in that way of constructing government, that confidence in the way of constructing institutions was actually slipping away. But she did. I think she spotted that shift before it became the thing that people began to talk about. And it's also good if we go from the American context then to the European context in the 60s. In the 60s in Europe, we don't see that same kind of confidence in the progressive project. One thing we should remember when we're talking about the European Union, this is something that is not the way the European Union describes itself, where it says, look, we set up these institutions after the Second World War, and we've constantly grown them, and the map has gotten larger, and we started off as the European Economic Community, and now we're at the stage of the European Union. It's all just been this steady process of ever closer union. That's not what happened at all. They were by the 50s, especially with the failure of the Common Defense Project. It looked like European progress had stalled. And then you throw someone like de Gaulle in to be leader of France, who's very skeptical in many ways of the way the project proceeds. It doesn't look like you have confidence in that way of governing, that way of proceeding, that the confidence in developing that political form. And indeed, I once looked at the data on this of some Western European countries to see how much they were spending as a percentage of spending in terms of their state, in terms of the government as a percentage of GDP, assigned to see is the welfare state growing or shrinking, are people spending more? And by the 1960s, the US government is actually exceeding them. The US government is devoting more as a percentage of GDP to government expenditure than the so-called European welfare states. The trend changes in the 1980s, late 70s, 1980s. I have to look at the numbers there to see. But this again belies our goes against the way we tend to perceive that, which is Europe is the one that goes in the direction of welfare state. Maybe they're socialist, and then America is the one that repudiates that. Maybe they're a little too capitalist or whatever. That's the kind of standard narrative, or that could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing, depending on your politics. But that's not what is happening in the 1960s, and Arendt spots that, and I think it's actually quite a helpful lodestar for us to understand what was going on in that period, and then to take it back to what you initially raised, the reason why you have rejection of that, perhaps most visible in the United States from '68 onwards, but also there in Europe. You just had to know where to look for it.
Okay. Um, I believe it was the first section of The Origins of Totalitarianism that Arendt deals with anti-Semitism. So she was reflecting, for the most part, on the Dreyfus Affair, which this year we're celebrating or commemorating the 130th anniversary of Colonel Dreyfus's conviction, and also of the rising anti-Semitism in the U.S. and the West. It's also a very relevant point to discuss. Now, one of the things that she commented on, and I think it's something that can be still shocking to many, that a political movement can spring up because of the hatred of the Jewish race, and no matter from the left or from the right, really. So why are this population, the Jews, not any other population, um, grows, or at least the hatred of this one particular population, how can this grow into a movement that, well, as in the case with the Nazis, totalitarian in nature?
Well, that's one of the questions that she's preoccupied with in the first part of Origins of Totalitarianism, as you say. I think there are a couple explanations, but I think it's important to just to see one thing that she wants to make in the study of it, and this is what makes the account that she provides rather provocative. She doesn't want to tell a story of persistent anti-Semitism that was always there in Europe and it's always been the same thing, and it kind of emerges, or Nazism is the culmination of it. That's always been the case. She's trying to look at different ways that that you shift that the attitude of, say, the Christians, or the attitude of the elites changes with respect to the Jews. One important theme that I think that she brings out, that is just worth reminding our listeners of, if they don't have a chance to read the sections themselves, is that this is coming out of the breakdown of the nation state. The nation state promised to bring a kind of emancipation, right? Free up these different peoples who were subject to different kinds of a different legal system, a different juridical system, one that excluded them from participation in the main juridical system. The political emancipation of the Jews of the French Revolution and afterwards was meant to dissolve that, was meant to create one single nation, one single people who would be there and be recognized as such, and there would be no special juridical category set aside, right, for other peoples. It would all be subject to the same juridical status. And there's a way that this project backfired, or at least it couldn't work, and that's what she's interested in bringing out in her discussion of where European politics go awry in the 19th century. What is interesting, though, to see, and can be quite troubling to read, and so we have to read this with a certain finesse, is that she does think as many anti-Semites suggested or indicated in the late 19th, early 20th century, um, that Jews did wield an enormous amount of financial and then translated into political power, which helped construct and build the nation state. Now, what she wants to say, though, is that by the end of the 19th century, that wasn't the case anymore. The economic landscape had shifted. You have the rise of the bourgeois, the bourgeoisie, and that had displaced the influence that lay with older Jewish families, those that had helped build up the monarchy and helped build up the strong state that went with the modern monarchy, the early modern monarchy, and afterwards. So those let's call them tropes were no longer true, and so the strangeness of this whole period is that just at the moment whereby Jewish influence is decreasing is when you have the rise of mass anti-Semitism in the form that is the genuinely modern form. So not the same as saying, oh, the Jews are the ones who killed Christ, so they bear a kind of blood guilt for that. It's not a theological criticism. It's something wholly different that she wants to draw out. And the other thing too that is also again you need to kind of finesse to see what her point is here is she sees the rise of a certain type of Jewish elite who flaunted their distinctiveness in a certain way, kind of the theater performance of what you would associate with characteristics of Jews, as helping exacerbate this cycle. Of the creation of mass anti-Semitism. So the Disraeli figure is the one that she singles out for particular criticism. So what she's again, I think what's important to see in her picture is that we have a period, the 19th century and towards the latter half, of immense confusion and upheaval. We have a change in the economic order. We have the promise of this political system of emancipation, of total assimilation that doesn't run up against the reality. And then we have this intermingling between let's put it like this. You have this movement from Jews as being on the fringe and maybe influential in financial aspects, but not much else, to suddenly become a kind of social type, a kind of fashionable social type, the Disraeli figure, again, the parvenu figure, as Arendt calls it. So you have all these upheavals going on, and into that, into this chaos and this, you have then the emergence of mass anti-Semitism. But what I think is important to see is that the context of this is the breakdown of the nation state. It's the failure of the project of the nation state to realize its vision and the consequences as that begins to decay. But B, we're not just looking at a mob or the proles who become anti-Semitic. We see this way of thinking moving between mass society and elites and crossing back and forth, as also Jews are moving in between both elements. So it's quite a complicated picture that she gives. And so when we come to understanding the Dreyfus affair, the framing of Captain Dreyfus, of Captain Dreyfus, for what happened, we have to bear this context in mind. And that's why her account of Dreyfus isn't that he's a hero. He's certainly not in the picture she gives, and that seems to bear with the historical account too. He's not. It's not. It's very difficult to see him as a kind of heroic martyr figure when we look closely at the record. We rather see that the Dreyfus affair is a proxy for these other kinds of conflicts. We can call it a culture war, a social war might be even more accurate because it describes the fact that these conflicts are playing out through all these different social dynamics. And essential for her in this picture is that we don't see what ends up happening with the Dreyfus affair, the revelation that the evidence was planted and so forth, as being the end point of the story, in one in which we give accolades to the Republican order, which is the way that Republicans wanted to tell it. Like the Third Republic rose up and crushed the anti-Semitic aspects of society that were associated with tradition, with the church, with the army, and whatever. And it's a great victory for the Republican values, or however you want to say it. That kind of account is one that she thinks doesn't bear out with what really happened. In fact, what we saw are the weakness of all the institutions. And when you think then about how the Third Republic ended up, in kind of this long, slow decline, coming out of that period, I think you see that there's a lot in her reading that is very insightful. And just to relate it to a point that I said toward the start, a point that runs against the kind of innate or habitual progressivism with which people want to see that period. And she's challenging that. In fact, she's setting up the picture of a kind of degenerate regime that is not going to be able to withstand the storms that are coming.
And another important theme of the origins of totalitarianism is well, is twofold actually. One is that totalitarian movements and polities feed on the feelings of alienation amongst people in the modern society. And two, modern society, according to Arendt, is actually actively manufacturing this kind of loneliness and alienation that the totalitarian movements are preying upon. And I think if there is any other point that's more relevant, I'm not sure. But tell me, how does contemporary society breeds this kind of alienation that may evolve into, harmful mass movements?
Well, it's a great question, and I think you also had an excellent explanation. I think of what Arendt is saying about this. Um, there are definitely a number of ways that we could draw attention to. We could speak in terms of, say, Robert Putnam style analysis, and he actually draws from Tocqueville, and Tocqueville is one of the influences for Arendt in making this argument. So there's a nice little connection in all of this. The kind of Robert Putnam style argument about the breakdown of social trust, the loss of civil society, and that's something that Arendt is concerned with, because then you basically have no median institutions between the individual and the government and the state. So that's certainly, if you're worried about the impending click clack of jackboots, that's certainly something to bear in mind. But perhaps the more subtle or difficult thing to apprehend in part of our argument is the one in which we don't see the state as the enemy, or at least the state isn't the thing that we need to worry about, or the only thing we should worry about, perhaps. It's the notion that in our social relations, when we fall into this, we create a mass social situation in which society is likely to be captured by particular kinds of social movements. So society here is the problem. And again, we could think about this with respect to someone like Tocqueville, who's the problem of the tyranny of the majority, the kind of stultifying conformism that comes with that, the suppression in various ways of individuality is something that is going on there. So the sense that we worry about that we should be worried about this kind of social dynamic is something that troubles her immensely. I think a third point, just to speak more to the contemporary moment that we should consider, is what kinds of institutional or technological changes might be exacerbating the move towards social alienation, towards loneliness. And here I put it, this is the problem of the digital age. This is the problem of the smartphone. This is the problem of having our interactions mediated by particular kinds of devices rather than through human interaction. And then what kind of social movement or indeed political movement comes out of that? That's one of the most troubling questions, I think, of our times. And it's very hard to bought that because we have to make what is something we don't pay much attention to or assume is just neutral, namely technological change, and bring that out into the open and really examine it to ask the fundamental question: is this good or bad? And if you think about the problem of loneliness, this begins to look like a completely bad thing. and that's, I think, one thing we should bear in mind. I think one of the best applications of Arendt's book Origins for the contemporary moment is not to take it and think, oh well, which political candidate best maps on to the kinds of descriptors that she's talking about when she describes the development of National Socialism as a mass party, right? Which political candidate can we figure meets that typology? I think the more troubling side of it is to ask what kinds of technological transformations, institutional transformations are taking place that produce the loneliness that she's talking about. And it's troubling to do because it affects the very way we live and devices now that we take for granted. We have to make those relationships to those technological devices that are often implicit or assumed, or things that are, I don't wear glasses, but those people who do, right, you don't notice you're wearing glasses when you put them on. That's what you do the very first time you wear glasses, and then after that you forget that they're there. But that's becoming our relationship in a way to the smartphone, to the internet, in a lot of respects. Technological changes that we just take for granted, that have become essentially an extension of ourselves, might be, to put it bluntly, destroying our humanity. Probably are. Uh, and reading Arendt in light of those questions, I think, is particularly insightful.
So I'd like to end on this note. You wrote in the essay about the intensification of bureaucratic control in Europe. The obvious culprit is the EU, and I think this is something that American commentators do not understand about not just Hungary but European nations. Is that there's a constant stream of negotiations on what is a nation state's place in the European Union and what is Brussels' place in the nation state's governance. And many, many more arguments flow from there. But I guess to stick to the theme of Arendt and totalitarianism, how much are the elites of a given society, um, how much are they responsible for, say, bringing out the conditions that may bring about totalitarian governance?
Well, they're definitely involved in the process. I think that's part of her argument. I mean, again, the very provocative thing that she says is that the attitude, the transformation of the Jewish elite in the 19th century to become like this is partly complicit in the social transformation. That's probably the most provocative, controversial thing that she says. But we can scale it down a bit and think in terms of what ideals were associated with the nation state that became part of the governing elite, and assumptions that they had about how to assimilate, uh, and so forth, that just began to structure the assumptions that everyone made about politics and those that they wanted to impose upon the rest of their population. So we should we should definitely see that, and this isn't the place to give the full account of the origins of the European Union, for instance, but just on noting on monetary policy. The euro was not a project that there was popular aspirations or demands for. Even in the business sector, right? The German business sector in the 1980s was opposed to the notion and thought it was a disaster to implement it. You still had people in the German financial apparatus criticizing or worried about the implementation of the euro into the 1990s, after the timeline had already been set up. So these are decisions that have made decisions with dramatic import, right? Just ask the people of Greece about the euro, right? These are decisions that have imports on the whole continent, on 500 million people, and have had particularly brutal consequences on, say, the people of Greece, amongst others, that were elite driven. And any account of the expansion of the bureaucratic apparatus now, but also in Arendt's narrative too, has to bear this aspect in mind. It's not necessarily, and she doesn't think this, and I don't think this is an accurate portrayal of what took place in the late 80s, early 90s as well. It's not so much a cabal, a secret backroom group that organizes and designs everything. But there are people in power who are pushing it in certain directions, and they happen to be effective in some respects and ineffective in other respects. And any account of what happened has to take that into play, has to take the actions of elites into play, and therefore their responsibility.
I think we can end on that note. Thank you very much, Nathan Pinkoski, for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.